we're going to hear from the editor of that journal you may have heard of, The Lancet. And that's Richard Horton, and he's going to come on screen in a moment. Richard is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. He's been with The Lancet since 1990. I think he's the longest-serving editor of a major journal I'm aware of, actually. So he's been there an awfully long time, and he's really seen The Lancet change dramatically over this period of time. And The Lancet really has transformed over the last, 20 years in a very significant way. So he's going to talk about mega trends in publishing. I haven't actually watched his video yet. I thought I'd save it for now. I hope you'll enjoy it. I hear it's excellent from the people who have seen it. Thanks very much. Let's play it, please.
Can't be with you in person. Nick's charge was to talk a little bit about the megatrends that are facing medical journal publishing over the next 25 years, so out to around 2050. The danger of that charge, of course, is that I'm going to repeat a whole bunch of stuff that you know already. The malicious use of artificial intelligence, the evolution of open access and open science, the existence of paper mills, and even the overall sustainability of the journal publishing system and peer review itself. So what I'd like to do is to try and take a slightly different approach and focus less on the internal mechanics of the publishing system, which I acknowledge are extremely important, but focus more on the existing political, economic, social, technological, environmental context and forces that are actually shaping medical journals today and that will shape them over the next 25 years. Plus, I'd like to talk a little bit about how those issues may influence the purpose of scientific journals themselves. Now, maybe I can just begin with the idea of our destiny. At its very simplest, destiny means our future. Where are we going? But it also has two other very specific meanings that I think are relevant in thinking about our future. The first is that destiny is linked to the idea of fate. That's to say that our future is utterly predetermined, it can't be avoided, that it's governed by inviolable laws. In other words, that we are, in a sense, doomed. Another way of looking at destiny is that actually destiny, our future, depends on our own conscious actions and choices. We have the freedom and we have the responsibility to influence our futures, what happens in our futures. So our destiny, our future then, exists between the tensions of what is unavoidable and what we can do to ameliorate or to mitigate the very worst elements of what is unavoidable. So what are the large forces, those megatrends that Nick wanted me to talk about, that are determining our future? These forces that we cannot avoid and that we have to respond to. There are many megatrends that are shaping our future today and the future of medical publishing. And I could give you a very long laundry list of what those trends are, but I don't want to do that either. I want to try and divide them into two categories. The first is those trends that are, in a sense, intrinsic to who we are, to the human condition. And second, those trends that are extrinsic to the human condition, even if they've been precipitated by our own actions. So first, let me talk a little bit about our health future and how it's going to be shaped by qualities that are inherent in our evolution as a species. I'm going to just choose a few examples that seem to me to be particularly important. Number one, we exist in an aging society, and that aging society is rapidly taking place across all populations of the world and is transforming our societies, whether we're looking at aspects of social care or other dimensions of the way we organize our societies. The fact that we are gradually aging is changing the nature of human society. Let's look at one dimension of that from a health perspective: dementia. We're going to see the number of people in the world living with dementia increase from about 60 million today to, by 2050, 150 million. By any standards, that is transformational in not only the way we think about human society, but in the way we think about our health systems. Now, just a few weeks ago, we launched the third iteration of a Lancet Commission on dementia, which in a sense looks forward to what the possibilities are for mitigating the impact of dementia on our societies and on our health systems. And just to take two aspects of what that commission concluded, one on treatment, one on prevention. In terms of treatment, we're in a very exciting phase where we have new disease-modifying agents to manage dementia. But if you look at the trials of those disease-modifying agents, they come with an enormous cost, and the cost is the fact that we're going to have to completely redesign the way we deliver healthcare and deliver the relationship between primary, secondary and tertiary care. Why is that? Because currently today we are going to have to scale up screening services, we're going to have to scale up imaging services because of the adverse effects, potential adverse effects of these new drugs, and we're going to have to recognize that the investments we make in health systems are also going to have to increase quite substantially. So if we embrace treatment for a tripling of the numbers of people with dementia around the world, that is going to be a very different kind of health system that we're going to be thinking about than the one we have today. The Commission also looked at the impact of prevention, and here again we have enormous and exciting opportunities, but opportunities that require us to rethink entirely the way we deliver healthcare and think about the notion of prevention and public health in the context of our wider society. Because what we know is today that there are 14 modifiable risk factors that, if they were fully implemented, so to speak, we could prevent or delay almost half, 45% in fact, of cases of dementia. Now that's the big opportunity, the big prize, so to speak. But in order to do that, in order to address issues around education, head injury, physical activity, smoking, alcohol use, high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, hearing loss, loneliness, depression, air pollution, vision loss, and also high cholesterol. All those are the 14 elements we need to intervene on. You can see that we need a much more aggressive and joined up multi-sectoral approach to the way we think about preventing or delaying the onset of dementia. Again, a transformation in our health systems will be needed. Let me take a second example of a factor that's intrinsic to the human condition, and that is demographic change. Now, this time I'm just going to go out beyond 2050 to the end of the century, 2100. Currently, the population today is about 7.6 billion. 7 to 8 billion people. By the end of the century, it will be no higher than 8.8 billion, and we'll probably get a peak population around 2064 of 9.7 billion people. So it will peak in 2064 and then start to decline. But those figures don't really tell you the dramatic changes that we're going to see in populations in different regions. I think the most important, the most significant, the one with the biggest impact is going to be the change in population in sub-Saharan Africa from about 1 billion people today to 3.1 billion by 2100, a tripling in the number of people on the continent of Africa. But that's going to be complemented by some pretty incredible depopulation episodes in other countries. Now, this is the Asia Pacific Association of Medical Journal Editors, so let me turn my attention specifically to the Asia Pacific region, because your region, by the end of the century, is going to be very different demographically than it is today. We're going to see China's population, Japan's population, South Korea's population, and Thailand's population halve. Those 4 countries will only have 50% of their population in 2100 compared to what it is today. I mean, that is astonishing in terms of the social change that will bring. It's also astonishing because what it will do is reduce substantially the working age population that can generate the income that is necessary to provide investments for health, education, welfare, and other social services and social protections. So in a sense, the very social contract that exists in society today across those 4 countries between government and people is going to be under threat simply because the demographics of those countries do not add up in terms of a viable economic system, unless you can turn fertility rates around, or unless migration can replace the population that simply won't be there by the end of the century. But it's not only those 4 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. You're also going to see moderate to slight declines in populations in other countries, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Indonesia, in Laos, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka. Only 2 countries are going to see substantial increases in population in the Asia-Pacific region, and that's Malaysia and the Philippines. Now, I'm not arguing that demography is 100% our destiny. Remember, we have choices. We have freedoms and responsibilities to change our future if we wish to do so. But what I am saying is that the current trajectory of our demography is massive in terms of the changes that it's going to bring. And don't think that it's only the Asia-Pacific region that's going to have this challenge. I'm speaking to you from London, and the European region is also going to have its challenge. Italy is going to see its population halve by the end of the century. Spain, Greece as well, also going to see their population halve. Poland will see its population go from 38 million to 15 million. Germany will see a sizable contraction in its population. And while we're about it, we have this war taking place between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. Russia's population is projected to fall by 40 million people by the end of the century to just over 100 million. And Ukraine's population is projected to collapse from 45 million people today to 18 million by the end of the century. So these changes are going to radically reshape our world, and they're going to increase the pressure for migration from regions of the world where there will be higher populations to regions of the world where there will be societies in need of population. And I would predict, at least based upon the catastrophic scenes that we see in many societies today, not least my own, that we're going to see the impact of racism and discrimination and bias become a much more significant element in the way we think about other peoples in our society. And racism is a health issue. Migration is a health issue. And so we as a health community need to be thinking about how these demographic changes are going to be shaping our health systems and the debates we have about the future of health. And of course, all of this is going to feed into big geopolitical shifts in power. The old power structures, whether they be the G7 or the UN Security Council, which are really post-war anachronisms, post-Second World War anachronisms, they're going to lose their legitimacy. And I might say some of the existing institutions in science are going to lose their legitimacy. And I include myself in that area of legitimacy. The Lancet has been around for 200 years and we have acquired a certain legitimacy. But why? Why? And do we deserve that legitimacy? If we're going to see populations increase in other parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, why should the center of gravity of journal publishing be in the United Kingdom or the United States? Why shouldn't it be in Africa? Why shouldn't it be in the Asia-Pacific region? Why shouldn't it be in Latin America? Why should English be the dominant language of science? Many of our what we come to regard as accepted truths today in science, by the end of this century, I think are going to be under severe challenge. And rightly so, because human society is dynamic. It should be dynamic. And power shifts should take place according to those demographic changes. So watch this space. It's really going to be quite surprising, I think, over the next 100 years what we see. Those are the intrinsic forces. Let me briefly turn to the extrinsic forces, which of course in some sense is more obvious to us because they are a collection of planetary crises that we've discussed on many occasions, and I don't want to waste time going into those in too much detail. But from climate to pollution, from biodiversity to poverty, from pandemics to war and conflict, from the current challenge of anti-science and misinformation to loss of trust in many of our institutions. Now, there are no simple solutions to these crises at all, but I do believe that journals have an important part to play in mediating discussions and debates, not just within professional communities, but publicly and politically. And here, of course, we have a tension, because what I want to see is greater freedom of speech in all countries to allow these debates to take place, to allow us to build awareness to these planetary threats. And in too many countries today, there are authoritarian regimes that limit freedom of speech, limit freedom of association and freedom of expression. And we as journal editors should be on the front lines of campaigning for greater freedom of speech in countries so we can have true democratic debates about these issues. But of course, me calling for greater freedom of expression also opens the door to misinformation and disinformation. And this is the double-sided threat that we face. If we improve our access to freedom of expression, how do we remove the threat of misinformation and disinformation? And honestly, we don't have an answer to that question at the moment. The fact is, though, that pouring more truth into a system that polarizes and favors often untruth isn't going to be the simple solution that we would hope that it could be. Social media polarize us, and that is an environment where untruths can be propagated very quickly, very easily, and conspiracy theories can thrive no matter how much we try to challenge them or to remove them. But I am hopeful about the role that health can play. Now, I don't want to come across as naive or overly simplistic here, but last year we published an interesting commission that looked at the contribution of health equity and gender equality to creating the conditions for peaceful societies. And the basic idea is that you can create a virtuous environment by focusing on health equity and gender equality. Why? Because with health equity as a central issue in our society, it forces you to confront the value and dignity of every human being in society, the importance of and the scarring importance of health disparities, the fact that we need to use the notion of universal health coverage and stronger health systems as a means to develop human potential. Gender equality is another important dimension of creating this virtuous environment, because by focusing on gender equality, it demands that we take more seriously the rights of women and girls and their right to equal access to education and other resources in society, and their right to participate equally in the social and political processes of society. Now, as I say, I don't want to come across as naive that health and gender equality are going to solve all the problems of the planet. They're not. But I do believe that they can play a part, an important part, making a contribution to a fairer and more peaceful society and world. Now, of course, the future of medical journals will be shaped by the ebb and flow of changes in disease trends, and we have many of those trends that we are all familiar with today, whether we're talking about overweight and obesity, the spread of arboviruses, the epidemic of non-communicable diseases, including mental ill health and addictions. And we live in a world that's full of contingency, in other words, where we have an array of future possibilities that we're not able to predict. In the sense, the counterpart of destiny is contingency. Destiny has these unavoidable threats that we know about today, but contingency has these potential jeopardies that are impossible to be precise about, whether we're talking about antimicrobial resistance, food insecurity, spillover zoonoses, you name them, you can name them better than I can. So let me end with two brief conclusions and a question about who we are and our purpose. The first conclusion is that I think that you and I, as editors, we are engaged in a great struggle. I would say that in some ways it's the greatest struggle in our world today, not just as editors, but as citizens, as health workers, or as scientists. And it's how we view the world. Are you a globalist or are you a nationalist? If you're a globalist, then you believe in the idea of a single, interdependent world community, motivated by the idea of a concern for equity and insisting that we have duties and we have obligations to one another across nations, across borders, and that one of the most important duties and obligations that we have is health. If you're a nationalist, on the other hand, the idea that you will cling to is the notion that our primary or even our exclusive concern should be our commitment to our own country. That oft used phrase, charity should begin at home. And the idea that patriotism should be our primary objective. And I will just recall that in President Donald Trump's first term, and hopefully his only term, indeed, he was the one who went to the United Nations and drew the contrast between a globalist perspective and what he called a patriotic or nationalist perspective. That's the struggle that we're engaged in today. And you and I have to answer the question, which side are we on in that struggle? The second conclusion is very simple, but one that we often forget, but one that COVID-19 should have taught us and should be inscribed on our hearts as well as our brains, and that is that progress is not inevitable and the gains we have made are easily lost. So a question to end. And the question is, who are we as journal editors? What do we consider ourselves as? And I ask this question because there is some uncertainty about it. A wonderful book written by Peter Bartrip was a book about the history of the British Medical Journal, and I strongly recommend it to you. It's a great read about a great journal. The book was called A Mirror of Medicine. The idea that a scientific journal is a mirror of medicine is perfectly legitimate and reasonable and respectable. But is that really what we are? Are we simply holding up a mirror to our profession, to medical science, and reflecting that profession and science in the work that we do? Or are we something more than that? Should we be more engaged, more committed? Should we be advocates? Indeed, should we be actually activists on the front lines of these debates and these struggles? And I want you to ask yourselves that question. Are you holding up a mirror, or are you an activist taking part in this great struggle and this grave struggle between globalism and nationalism? Now, each of you may have a different answer to this question, and I'm not going to answer the question for you. But I think I would conclude that it is the most important question facing us as a community today. And your answer, the answer you give to that question, may well, at least in part, and I say this with all humility, but your answer to that question may well in part determine our future, our destiny on this very fragile earth of ours. Thank you very much.